Hi everyone, Stepan here. Today we're going to go over my Najdorf repertoire for black. So as you may know, since I started playing the Sicilian, I've mostly been playing knight c6 instead of the Najdorf, and I would go into the Sveshnikov or the Rossolimo. So after e4, c5, knight f3 in the open Sicilian, I normally go knight c6, or I did up to this point. And actually my last tournament game in the Trieste Open went like this. It was a Rossolimo. But since then, I started seriously preparing my Najdorf repertoire because knight c6 is very easy to prepare against, I believe, because there are only a few main variations white needs to be ready for, whereas d6 leads to more complicated types of positions. One of the main problems black has after d6 is all the Najdorf variations white could choose. So this repertoire here deals only with the Najdorf and only from black's perspective. If you want a theoretical overview of the Najdorf, you can find it below. I've covered variations for both sides. Today we are focusing on ideas instead of theory. So d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, a6 is the beginning of the Najdorf. Everything we look at from here on is going to be from this position after move 5 for black. The repertoire is below. If you want to follow it, you can find the PGN in the description, and you can find the repertoire on Nokti as well. There's a link there. So if you need an easier way to follow the video, go to those links first before we start. Okay, we are going to be looking at 12 different moves for white. We're going to be looking at bishop e3, which is the English attack. It's closely connected to f3, so let's consider these almost identical. Those lead to the English attack. Then we're going to be looking at bishop g5. That's the second most popular way for white to play. It usually leads to the poison pawn variation if black wants to go queen b6. We're going to discuss that, but black in our repertoire isn't going to go queen b6. Then we're looking at bishop e2, which is the Opocensky variation or the Opocensky variation. And those are the sort of three main ways to play. So the three main ways for white to play are bishop e3, bishop g5, and bishop e2. Those are the main lines. There are many sidelines though. So we're going to be looking at all the sidelines, starting with the Adams attack, which is something I have played myself. Bishop c4, which is called the Lipnitsky. Then there is f4, which doesn't really have a name. There is g3, that's my favorite with white, called the Zagreb Variation. Also, I'm from Zagreb, so that makes sense. a4 also doesn't have a name. And then bishop d3, knight b3, and finally rook g1. These are the sidelines. So we are going to devote time to each, starting with the main lines and moving all the way down to rook g1. Before we go into that, before we start with theory, I want to talk about the Najdorf structure. Whenever we can, as black, we are going to play the move e5 very early. If we look at this typical Najdorf starting position, there's a knight on d4. So usually e5 comes with tempo, and there is only one line when on move 6 white voluntarily plays knight b3 in this position. If white plays knight b3, then we are going to deviate and we are going to be playing e5 because it doesn't give us a tempo. And the second variation in which we don't play e5 will be bishop to c4. And the reason we don't play e5 against the Lipnitsky attack is because, well, there's already pressure on f7. So against those two, knight b3 and bishop c4, we are playing e6, not e5. Against all 10 other variations, and sometimes against these two later on in the game, we are going to get the structure with e5, which is known as the Najdorf structure. Now, I would recommend that you take books like Chess Structures by Mauricio Flores, Zlotnick's Middle Game Manual, those two come to mind now, which deal with pawn structures and strategy and piece placement and planning, and not the opening itself. That's going to teach you how to navigate the structures. I'm going to try to tell as much as I can here, though. So when we look at the Najdorf structure, there are two main themes that everyone needs to know. Firstly, by playing e5, black creates a backward d pawn and a hole on d5 for white to exploit. So one of white's main strategic goals is going to be to occupy d5 with a piece, trade down material until a favorable imbalance occurs. One of the most common ones is the good knight versus bad bishop Najdorf position, where imagine white has a knight on d5, black has a dark squared bishop on e7. That bishop can never evict the knight, nothing can touch the knight, the bishop is bad, white is strategically much better. So that's the consequence of e5. You might think, well, why does black play e5? It comes with a lot of upsides, and many of them are dynamic, and many of the downsides black is going to be able to fix throughout the game. So when we look at this pawn structure, it's easy to understand that black's main pawn break is d5. So black is going to be playing for d5 very early on in the game, and if the opportunity arises for you to break open this position with d5, get rid of this weakness, you should. The second feature of this position is the very natural placement for both kings. Black in the Najdorf really only castles kingside or leaves the king in the center. It wouldn't make any sense to castle queenside. It's much safer to leave the king on e8. Whereas white can castle both sides. More often than not, white's going to castle queenside in the English attack and in many other variations. What does that mean? Well, one of the main consequences of the Sicilian is that white is, of course, trading their d pawn for black's c pawn. So black not only has an extra central pawn, but black has a semi-open c-file. So one of the main things here is the attacking potential for both sides, where if we imagined white's king on c1, black's king on g8, it's obvious that white wants to do this, and black wants to line up stuff against c2, play b5, and break through on the queen side. So having those very, very, very basic things in mind, we can now move on to the Najdorf. So let us begin with the English. So the English attack isn't really a variation. As I said, we can consider 6 bishop e3 and 6 f3 the same line. So these two moves do the same thing in 99.9% of the games because they transpose. And white's idea behind these two moves is to castle queenside quickly. Now, in this position, when white avoids bishop e3, it is possible to go knight g4, which is why sometimes white plays f3 to prepare that. But against this, black can simply throw in bishop g5, and in order to justify this, we would have to go h6 and bishop h4 and g5 and bishop to g3, which isn't such a big deal for white. That being said, if I had white in this position and I wanted to play the English attack, I would play f3 first. And I think f3 is a superior move, simply because it avoids knight g4. We aren't going to be playing knight g4 as black, but it's still annoying if you're white and you need to prepare for this. So if they start with f3, it just avoids one possibility. Still, against bishop e3, we're not playing knight g4, we're playing e5. Okay. Now, white has really only two good options in this position. Knight b3 is the main move. Knight f3 is the second good option, but it reduces white's attacking possibilities, and it also again introduces this option of knight g4, and it prevents white from playing f3. So it's very unlike the English attack to play this way, and almost no one will, or almost no one who isn't very experienced will not play like this. Against this we go bishop e7, white goes bishop c4, and after castles, we develop the usual way, bishop e6. Now I want to talk about the placement of this bishop first. So we said that d5 is the key square in the Najdorf. So how does that look in practice? Well, there are many more obvious examples, which we are going to move on to, but you can basically challenge the d5 square with three different pieces. The knight that's already on f6, the bishop that's on e6, and the knight on b8. And the knight on b8 can come to b6. That may happen before or after b5, but that's another way to challenge d5. So what we're trying to achieve is we're trying to achieve a position where if white lands a piece on d5, we exchange and white isn't able to recapture with the piece anymore. As long as white's able to keep recapturing with pieces, they have a useful hole on d5 they can exploit. If they are forced to play e takes d5, then the problem's gone. Our backwards pawn has been covered and there's no hole for their pieces to exploit anymore. Okay, back to knight f3. So white has many ways to play against this. If they take on e6, this is great because we have covered the d5 square, and white's going to start playing for knight a4 and for the b6 square. So in this position, I really think that we have to deal with this. Most people are going to continue with knight g4 and try and evict that bishop. I think knight f to d7 is more precise because we simply cover b6 and the other knight can comfortably come to c6 later. So this is a line I think is worth mentioning. I'm not going to talk about all the lines in the repertoire during the video because it would take 2 days. Okay, but the most common way by far is knight b3, most common way for white to play in the English attack. So after e5, knight b3. And now again, let's talk about the d5 square. And I'm going to use the English attack as the most obvious example of what both sides are trying to do. So bishop e6, fighting for d5, f3, preventing knight g4, preparing queen d2, and queenside castles. It was also possible to play queen d2 straight away. You can find that line in the repertoire. Now, black has a lot of ways to play against this, and if we do nothing, let's put it that way. If we do nothing, white's idea is to go g4. And you can see that in the theoretical playlist on the Sicilian and on the Najdorf. There are many lines in which white just goes g4. So the main move for black, and the move we are going to play, is h5. And the reason we play h5 is so that we don't allow g4. Now, if white goes g4 now, after h5, not only will we have opened the rook on h8, but also the e4 pawn is undefended after that trade. Okay, so white again has a couple of options. The most common one is knight d5. And we can now see that we can trade, and white's, of course, forced to recapture with the pawn, so we trade. Okay, and we get this typical structure where this hole has been fixed. But after knight bd7, queen d2, it's not really clear where our king should go. So what we're going to do is play g6. We can play g6 here, or in this position before knight bd7, g6. It leads to a very, very similar structure. Knight bd7 is actually a transposition. So white can castle queenside, or white can play bishop e2. The point is, we have a position where our biggest weakness has been covered. We aren't getting destroyed on the king side, and we can switch plans to what we think is appropriate, which brings me to one of the main things about the Najdorf. you have to adapt. And sometimes it's going to be necessary to start a queenside attack. Sometimes it's going to be necessary to defend on the king side. Sometimes you're going to leave your king in the center. Sometimes you're going to castle quickly. And the only way to know that is with experience. So for example, in this position, what I would recommend with black is to switch your attention to the c file. This pawn is hanging, of course, and there was no way to defend it, but also the knight on b6 now puts pressure down the c file. So knight b takes d5. You can also take with the f knight. Bishop to g5, bishop to e7, bishop d3, and now queen c7. We unpin and we start bringing the rooks over. One thing that's almost always true is that your king is just as safe on e8 as it is on g8. In fact, if you castled here, g4 would blast open the entire king side. So something like rook h1. Why would you castle here? Why would you castle kingside? I mean, it makes way more sense to castle kingside, but it also makes sense not to castle at all and just get on with your life. For example, knight b6 and you play for d5. Okay, and now castles queenside. So very often it's going to be just as safe to leave your king in the center or even castle queenside compared to castling kingside. So the English attack is the main line, and you need to keep calm and not panic. Let's look at queen d2 on move 8 for a second. So knight b d7. White can do many different things, but f3 is the main move. And now I prefer b5 straight away. So white's going to castle. And now we have to keep developing somehow. White goes g4. So notice that we have not played h5, so they have played g4. But the reason I wanted to show you this position is because this is the typical I'm attacking you and you're attacking me situation where neither side really cares about prophylaxis and they just keep going. So we're going to go b4. But the reason we're doing this is because we can chase the knight away. Of course, knight a4 would be bad. So knight d5, and so would knight b1. So knight d5, and now we can take. They are forced to take with the pawn. And whenever they are forced to take with the pawn, we have won a small victory. Knight b6, d5 is hanging. Okay, queen takes b4, knight takes d5, and it's sort of a trade, after which it's not really clear whose king is less safe. I always prefer black in these positions because it seems that the flexibility black has of you know, not having castled yet, and white's king is on c1, already a fixed target, always seems more comfortable for black. Okay, so that's the English, very briefly. We're going to try to fight for d5 very soon as we can, and we're going to try not to castle unless necessary. Now let's have a look at bishop g5. Bishop g5 is the second most popular move. Against this, we aren't going to go e5 because, of course, that would create a pin. I forgot that one. So we're playing e6 against bishop g5, bishop c4, knight b3. So e6, not e5. Okay, f4. And in this position, one of the most famous Najdorf variations is the poisoned pawn. But we're not going to do that. Instead, we're going to play a very rare move, h6. And if white takes on f6, black already has an edge, of course. So white should go bishop h4. And now again, you can transpose to something similar to the poisoned pawn with h6 thrown in, but we're not going to do that. We're going to play, once again, a very rare move. Knight b to d7. And now white either gets confused or, you know, knows what they're doing. White should play queen e2 or queen f3 and try to castle queenside quickly. The main move is queen to f3. Once they play queen f3, we play e5 and start disrupting. After knight f5, we now have to be slightly careful. We don't really have an easy way to develop anymore. If we play something like queen c7, then g3 is coming, the bishop's coming to g2. If we play something like well, we don't really have time to start a queenside attack because this knight is very, very dangerous. So what we want to do is we want to exploit the position of this bishop and the fact that we can take the pawn on f4. So this is not as forcing as the poison pawn variation, but it's just as complicated. The only thing is that it's far less risky for black, and it's unlikely that white's going to know it. So in this position, we're going to take on f4. Now, they have two options. They can either take on f4 or take on f6. If queen takes f4, then of course g5. That's the entire point. Now, white isn't losing or anything, but it's very close. They can mess up in a single move. So this is forcing. Knight takes d6, bishop takes d6, queen takes d6. Okay, g takes h4. Okay. And now, in order not to lose, white needs to play e5. If white doesn't play e5, if white plays, a random move, we're playing queen b6, and we are winning. So in this position, it's a knight up for us, and you may be thinking, well, what's white doing? So after queen takes f4, g5, knight takes d6, bishop takes d6, takes, we're up a knight. However, after e5, white has a way to get out of this mess. If we don't do anything, if we, I don't know, play queen e7, then white trades queens, gets the piece back, plays knight c7, and we could lose. So this is the point. Knight c7 is coming. We have to move our knight though, so we play knight g4. They play knight d5. And now we only have one move to stay in the game. Now we have to be careful. Queen g5. Of course, you don't want to get mated. White's threatening knight c7 mate now. So we have to do something. We need to create a square. So we need to move the queen away. Now the king has the d8 square. And now we're sort of safe. Knight c7, king d8. And now most people take on a8. You can also play e6. And it gets slightly less complex from here. Neither side's going to get mated. Now the engine still says white is fine, white is equal, but we have come dangerously close to black being just up a piece. So, okay. So that's the line with queen f4, which I don't think many people would play. It seems counterintuitive. Most people play bishop takes f6 and just avoid that entire line. And after bishop takes f6, knight takes f6, they can take on f4 now, but most people castle. And now simply bishop takes f5, e takes f5, and bishop e7. And we get this sort of weird position where the center is gone. This pawn on f4 is an interesting barrier against white's attack. And it's relatively equal. The engine says all zeros. But the reason I like this compared to the poison pawn is that it's definitely not as risky. Okay, now let's move on to the Opocensky. Now bishop e2 was played by Fischer and many strong players. It's considered to be one of the safest ways to play against the Najdorf, and it's one of the few variations where white's going to castle kingside. So e5. Okay, knight b3, bishop e7, our normal development, white castles. White doesn't have to castle queenside. White can play bishop e3 and, continue with queen d2 and then castle queenside anyway, but that's very, 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 very rare. And it's not really that good. Black is supposed to be slightly better. So when they play bishop e2, most likely they're going to castle kingside. So we castle kingside as well. Bishop e3, bishop e6, and in a sense this is a very symmetrical position. If we somehow put this pawn on c7, it would be basically identical. Okay, queen d2 for white, knight b to d7, and the Opocensky is a very natural variation for both sides. I don't think any moves really need explaining. What we're trying to do as black is we're trying to prepare d5. White doesn't allow that, and that's it. So a4, preventing b5 and expansion, and maybe planning to play a5. And now this is something I play in the Zagreb variation of the Najdorf, and the pattern you can see in many Najdorf, not just Najdorf variations, but whenever there's a pawn on a6 and this structure, playing a5 to be able to play knight a4 and occupy the b6 square is very common and very dangerous. On the other hand, we can start putting pressure on c2 to make sure that doesn't happen. So rook c8, a5, queen c7, and now of course knight a4. I'm just gonna take on c2. So there are many ways to play this. As white, I would play rook fc1 here to threaten knight a4. But against this, we can simply go queen c6, and now once again, if the knight moves away, we take on e4. So they have to defend. f3 is dubious because it weakens everything. So bishop f3. Bishop c4, occupying the diagonal that has just been vacated. And now they can go rook a4, they can go knight a4. If they actually go knight a4 here, they could be in trouble because e4 is hanging again. So they have to defend that first. So you can see that it's a fight for squares, and the Opocensky is not, you know, I'm pushing b5 and white's pushing g4. It's a more subtle type of game, and for me personally, more enjoyable. But just play normal moves. White can also play rook fd1 and, you know, just keep playing against d5. And again, very normal moves. Very normal moves. Rook d2. I like the idea of playing knight c5 when I can to provoke this trade and to get rid of my weakness. And now it is, you know, a fairly symmetrical position. Again, this is going to be our biggest weakness, but white's going to have to deal with e4 first by playing f3. Now we move on to the fun stuff. We're going to begin with the Adams attack, which is, and I played a game against Lovren Novosel, and in this position he played e6. I had white. He played e6, and I played a very nice knight d5 sacrifice that worked. Wasn't winning, but it worked. I was equal or better, and then I blundered and lost. We're not going to play e6. We're going to play e5, which is a more concrete way to play, and I'm going to explain why. So white can, first of all, white can go to b3 as well with the knight, but knight d2 is definitely a more dangerous move because it's trying to set up knight g3 in many positions. And it's more involved on the king side. Now, why is white playing h3? White's playing h3 to prepare g4. As we're going to see with the rook g1 mad freak attack, g4 is a move which, if white gets it in early, black could be in trouble. So this move, knight d2, makes more sense than knight b3. That being said, knight b3 isn't a bad move. It's in the repertoire. So how do we deal with this? Similarly to the Zagreb variation, white's trying to play, in this case, g4, in the case of the Zagreb, bishop g2. And they're trying to put the bishop on the same diagonal to support d5. So we cannot allow that. We have to play h5. h5 is not the only move, but it's by far the best move, because we don't want to allow an expansion. And now white's going to go g3. Okay, and we just get on with our life. So bishop to e6, bishop to g2, and this is very similar to the Zagreb Najdorf, as we're going to see, except that white has for some reason played h3 and we have played h5. So by doing this move order, you can transpose to the Zagreb Najdorf with h3 and h5 thrown in there. One thing to remember is play for d5 as quickly as you can. Castles, knight bd7, bishop to e3, bishop to e7. White's going to do something. Let's assume knight d5 because that's the most active. Notice that we don't have knight b6 because it's covered twice, but we can take because white's forced to take with the pawn. And at this position we have a very interesting dilemma. Most people take with the knight here because the pawn is on h3. You want to keep that bishop. And most people are going to play bishop takes d5, e d5, and bishop f5. And I think that's fine. I think that's justifiable. Although taking with the bishop is by no means bad. So from here, white goes f4, blasts through the center, we go rook c8, and the game goes on. So I think this is a great way to deal with the Adams attack, and it simplifies the play for black. Now if they go knight b3, we're going to try to do the same thing, but they may try to disrupt us by playing a very early f4. Now we go b5, they go f5, and the only thing that's relatively complicated is you have to remember to play bishop c8 and not bishop d7. So what you want is pressure down the long diagonal without interfering with the rest of your pieces. So from here, we're going to do the same thing and fight for d5 and try to play d5. So I don't think the Adams attack is complicated if you follow these very, very simple rules. Now, after knight d2, h5, white, of course, could go for something other than g3, and that alternative is bishop to g5. I don't think it's scary, bishop e6, and their idea is to trade on f6, queen f6, and play knight d5. But now, of course, we don't take because the queen could take, and you could be in trouble on b7. I played a game with a very similar pattern against Damian Horvat a few years back where he was in trouble precisely because of this. So we bring the queen back and we patiently build up pressure against d5. So white's going to be castling queenside, b7, castles queenside, g6, develop, king b1, okay, knight c5. Misplacing the queen, forcing the queen somewhere that either defends e4 or does something more aggressive. I think queen f3 is the best move. Queen a3 is playable. Let's say queen f3. Bishop to g7, knight e to c3. Okay, then b5. And we see one of the main problems black has in the Najdorf when white has time to consolidate on d5. And the same thing happens in the Sveshnikov, although in the Sveshnikov the knights go from a3 to c2 to e3 to d5. In this case, the knight goes from e2 from e3. So now it's very hard to fight for d5. And I wanted to show you this exact position because sometimes you simply have to let go. And this isn't happening anymore. You are not going to be able to fight for d5. White most commonly plays knight e3 here in order to be able to meet b4 with knight c d5. And notice that, well, the queen is on f3, the rook is on d1. That's it. You've lost that fight. You have to move on. You have to switch priorities. That's why I said in the Najdorf, it's very important to be flexible. Now, this position is by no means worse for black. It's only worse if we consider d5. We have lost that fight. But there are many more things we can do here. And in this particular case, we play for a kingside attack. Sorry, queenside, attacking white's game. Okay, let's have a look at bishop c4. Bishop c4, the Lipnitsky is, an interesting way to play. Fischer used to play this sometimes. He would normally play this against the classical Sicilian, so the Fischer shows him. But the ideas are very similar. We play e6 to avoid trouble down the diagonal, of course. White retreats the bishop, although there are alternatives. They could castle immediately. We go knight bd7, and white immediately starts an attack. There are a couple of moves here. They could castle, they could play bishop g5, they could also play queen e2, which is kind of weird, but the main move is f4. And after f4, white has begun a kingside attack and sort of committed already to well, eventually playing for e5 or f5. And f5 is going to be what white normally does. They're going to try to break through to f7 by playing f5 and challenging the e6 pawn. Now, there are a couple of ways to do this for black, but they all include playing knight c5 and putting pressure on e4 and putting pressure on the b3 bishop. they play f5, and we cannot take this pawn on e4. If knight ce4, then fe6. I don't know, let's say bishop e6, and we just lose on the pawn on e6. They can throw in knight e4 first, knight e4, knight e4, bishop e6, fe6, and you can see that this is already huge trouble. White doesn't take straight away, white castles. So don't do that. Instead, we have to keep developing. So bishop e7. Now this knight is defending, of course, e6, and we can castle before doing anything irrational. White has a couple of options here, but queen f3 is the most common move, increasing the pressure. Black castles, bishop e3, okay, and at this point we can choose to play queen c7 or e5. One of the main things is that we need to prevent white from playing e5, as difficult as that may seem to visualize and to understand its purpose. White needs to break down the center, and queen c7 is a move you play in many Sicilians, simply to prevent this breakthrough move, which usually works in conjunction with the rook on d1. Okay, you also could play e5 yourself, but I like to keep things flexible if I can. Okay, white castles, and now we keep going, b5. Okay, now we finally have something active to do. So against this Lipnitsky attack, remember to keep things flexible by playing e6. Don't commit to e5 even later on. Your development should be easy, and you should begin with knight c5. The reason you do that is to make white make concessions in order to defend e4. And also, if things go wrong, you can just snap off the bishop on b3. You always have that option. Okay, f4. Now f4 is a very rare move, and sometimes it's going to be very similar to this Lipnitsky attack idea, but most commonly people are going to play bishop d3 in conjunction with f4. So what we do here is e5, of course. Now white has a couple of moves. White can go to f3, which is the main move. Knight b3 is also playable. Knight f5 is kind of a mistake. Wait a second. Lucia, можете просто? Lucia is asking me if she can... Never mind. Where was I? Yes. So when we play e5, white needs to move the knight. That much is clear. Knight f5 really isn't a great move, and I'm going to show you why, even though it seems tempting. And trading is, of course, very bad. If white ever trades and then moves the knight, we can misplace their queen and misplace their king, of course, by trading queens. So if they play knight f5, we play knight c6. Okay, and now our goal is, of course, to play d5. And they are going to have to move the knight at some point. If they just continue developing, let's say, I don't know, bishop c4, then we can take on f5, e takes f5, and even throw in queen a5, and now we're threatening to take and to take. So most people are just going to move the knight back to g3, at which point we can start pushing with h5, and it's no longer easy for white to keep consolidating. So people who play f4 are usually going to play knight f3. Okay, and now the reason they play f4 is simply to have a square for the knight behind that f pawn. Okay, knight bd7, we pretty much do the same thing now. a4, white's going to try to fight for the b6 square again and try to prevent b5. Bishop to e7, bishop to d3, castles, castles, and knight c5. The reason we play knight c5 here is because we don't have a square for our bishop. We didn't really want to go bishop e6. When there was an option for white to play f5. And of course, if we had gone bishop e6 followed by knight bd7, we would have lost the game due to, of course, f5 trapping the bishop. So against this f4, just remember that that you develop the knight first, bring it to c5, and then you move on to developing the bishop. However, before you develop the bishop, you should resolve this tension by taking on f4, and that's the simplest way to do it, and then bishop g4. That way you avoid all problems. The Zagreb, my favorite variation. Now, black has two ways to play against this. It doesn't have to play e5. Black can also play e6, but we are gonna go e5. Okay, now the knight has to move. Knight e2 is the move. Knight b3 is playable, but not scary. Bishop e7, bishop g2. Why is the bishop here? White's fighting for d5. So we have to fight for d5. And against the Zagreb, you have to prepare that very, very early on. Black can be in trouble if they aren't aware that they have to overprotect d5 very quickly. So what we're going to do, before we castle, before we do anything else, we are going to bring this knight to b6. Okay, so white plays knight d5. If we took now, white would take with the queen, so no good. So knight bd7, knight ec3, knight b6. Okay, we still aren't ready, but given time, we will play bishop b7 or bishop e6 and trade. So now knight f6 is one of the most common ways to play, and b3, bishop e6. Now we are ready. Notice how white has traded off their knight on f6 before we had the opportunity to take and mess up their pawns. That's how white should play. If white isn't careful, if white plays b3 here, and we go bishop to e6, and they go bishop a3, then we take. And now they are stuck with a pawn on d5. And this is no good for white. Now we can play rook c8, followed by knight d7, queen b6, and f5. And our pawns are moving forward. We got rid of our weakness. So white needs to be careful. When this starts happening, white should trade and not give us the option to take on d5. Okay, so b3. This is my prep for white, actually, and this is how white should play. White should develop this bishop to a3. Okay, bishop e6, bishop a3, bishop e7. We have to defend the pawn, of course. Both sides castle. Queen d3 and queen c7. You can also go rook c8. So our goal now is to overwhelm c3 and c2. This is the downside of white's plan. They have to basically start defending now, either rook fc1 or rook fd1. And after rook ac8, also rook fc8 is possible. Let's say here, how do they defend? They either move the knight and lose the pawn, or they play bishop b4. That's the only move. And it's already getting uncomfortable. So what you can do here is you can switch your plans and play for d5, because by rerouting this knight, you're also defending a5 with your queen. Now it gets a bit more complicated. This is already the middle game, but this is the type of position we're trying to get, where we are doing two things. Firstly, we never allow knight d5 again, because we're threatening to take and they would have to recapture with a pawn. Secondly, enough pressure down the c-file to force white to commit a piece to defending c3. In short, that's what you're trying to achieve. I mean, it's still equal. Black isn't better or anything, but white needs to play very carefully. Okay, a4. a4 does not have a name. a4 transposes to many of the lines we've seen before. Now, it depends on where the knight goes. Most people play knight f3. I'll briefly show you the idea. So their goal is to play the very quick bishop g5. It's also possible to play bishop c4. And this is basically the Richter or the Fischer Sozen. They try to play the same way, but it's, I don't know. a4 is always a useful move. So I think this is just a way to avoid mainline theory, or try to confuse people who aren't familiar with exact move orders. Don't be confused. So their plan is to take on f6, to play knight d5. Again, you don't want to take if they can recapture with the queen, so knight d7, bishop c4, rook c8, queen e2, knight b6. Okay, now we are threatening to take. So they have to take on f6. Queen takes f6, bishop e6, queen e6, castles, castles. Now our only issue is that the knight is in front of this pawn. We would much rather have the knight on let's say c5 or e7. So now we have to work to reroute this knight somewhere useful. But as I said, it's really no big deal. From here, I like playing rook c6 and rook c8 and getting the knight to c8, or sorry, rook c6 first, then knight c8, knight e7, then rook fc8 or rook d8 to support d5. And I think it's strategically pretty simple. Again, we have gone well into the middle game. There's an interesting draw between Hui Fan and Carlsen from this position. I played in 2017. Okay, bishop d3. I mean, it's a move. It's nothing spectacular, though. It's a very rare move. After knight d2, White's idea was to get this bishop out of the way so that they can retreat the knight to e2 without blocking in the bishop and without, of course, committing the knight to b3 and to the queen side. So it's an interesting line because White's idea is to get the knight to g3 eventually. So all bishop d3 does is vacating, or not vacating, making sure that the bishop isn't blocked once the knight lands on e2. Okay, bishop e7, castles, castles, and knight g3. And against this, we're going to be doing the same thing. It's really, not a big deal. Now we are threatening to play d5. If White isn't careful, we'll play d5. So they have to play knight d5. Now White has to, White has to accept their pawn on d5 rather than allow us to play d5. So if White made a random move, we would go d5. And White doesn't want to allow that. So they much prefer having a pawn on d5 than allowing us to play d5. This pawn is immune due to bishop h7, of course. So now we play g6, threatening to take. White needs to defend. Knight b to d7, king h1, for example, rook e8. And now there are many ways to play. You can do this, for example. You can play rook c8. You can play for b5. What I like to do is treat this like a Sveshnikov, and I like to play rook c8 with b6 and queen c7 and very, very slowly try to put pressure on c4 and at some point expand with f5, if allowed. So bishop d3 is an okay idea, but it's really not scary. Okay, knight b3 is irritating because it moves the knight away before we can play e5. Now, you could still play e5. You could argue that it's just as useful, but I prefer e6. And White's idea here is to play g4. I don't think this attack has a name, but White moves the knight and then just starts storming the king side with g5 and h4. So we play b5. Bishop to g2, bishop to b7, g5. The knight always goes back to d7, and now they can castle, which personally I think is crazy, or they can play h4, which is the more common move anyway. And it's psychologically very difficult to castle in this position for black at any point. So bishop e7, White just keeps developing. So when I was designing this repertoire, I was trying to come up with a way to delay castling. The engine says castles is the second best move here. But the best move is b4. We're given a bit more time. Okay, so the knight moves away, knight e2. Now the best move is to castle, but I still tried to delay it, so a5. And the reason I'm trying to delay this is because I'm trying to see what White's going to do. If White castles kingside, then sure, I'm castling kingside. If White plays something like knight d4, then I'm very inclined to trade this first. Let's say set up a trade like this, and then try to find more waiting moves like knight c5. Because I don't care what the engine says. The castling might be the best move, and it might be 0.2 for white, while knight c5 is 0.3. But if I castle, then white just goes queen d2, castles queenside, and goes h5 and g6. The engine defends against that. Maybe I could, but I'm definitely not sure that I would defend successfully. So my advice here against knight b3 and against every similar type of idea in the Najdorf is to wait for white to castle if you can. Now finally, another crazy looking move, this is called the freak attack, became very popular recently, simply playing rook g1. There are a couple of games played recently. There's a game Carlsen Nepomniachtchi from 2020, and there's a game I really like, Ding MBL. And there's also Firouzja Caruana played last year. There are many games. There's actually a game between Kasparov and Divanchuk played in 2002. You have to see that game where white won. So the idea, of course, is to prepare g4. And white just doesn't go h3, they go rook g1. And of course, white is never castling kingside now. Okay, e5, we do the same thing. Knight b3, bishop e6, we do the same thing. We're fighting for d5. g4. By the time white plays rook g1 and g4, they have undefended d5. So d5. Now, you may think, well, g5 and we're losing. No, we're not. e4 is not defended enough, so we can take it. And knight takes e4. d takes e4 and queen d8. This is supposed to be okay for white. White isn't really down a pawn. They're gonna, they're gonna regain that pawn eventually. So bishop f5, and then they set up their pieces and eventually round up the pawn. But black does have a small edge, so I really don't think this is the way for white to play. So after d5, most people aren't going to go g5. They're going to play ed5. And now our goal has been accomplished. Knight takes d5, queen takes d5. Explain to me why white has a rook on g1 and the pawn on g4. I would just take black here. I don't think, with the queens off, with the center gone, I don't think this is good at all. We castle queenside and there are no problems. The only problem is the weak b6 square. Fine, that's a problem, but it's not a big problem. So the freak attack, not scary. Okay, I hope you managed to follow all of this. I know it was a lot. I hope I simplified it by attaching the repertoire below. I hope you were following everything along with the lines in the repertoire. Let me know what you think. The Najdorf is definitely the most dense opening for black in existence. It's I think more theory than the entire King's Indian or the entire, I don't know, Semi-Slav. So yeah, hope this was helpful. Again, let me know what you think. Stay tuned for more chess. Bye-bye.